So, what is WPC? What is Worlding Public Cultures? Well, Worlding Public Cultures, the Arts and Social Innovation, is a research project which brings together a transatlantic consortium of universities and museums in the UK, Canada, Holland, and Germany that aim to collectively rethink and remodel the impact of globalization in the museum and university sector. So it does this, or we do this, by working with a critical art theory and practice-based approach, taking the philosophical concept of worlding as its central methodology. More specifically, we aim to do three things you can see here on the slide. First thing is to challenge and to change public narratives about globalization and its impact on public institutions through a critical analysis and presentation of art, exhibitions, conferences, and academic writing about art and its cultural, historical, and socio-political realities. The second is to highlight or tell new stories from multiple regional perspectives about our transnationally and transculturally engaged presence, as well as our shared and sometimes difficult pasts. And we intend to imagine new ways of living together in the future. So as you can see, not much there, but quite ambitious. And the final thread, if you like, is by focusing on how the global is theorized and practiced in institutions. The project proposes concrete recommendations for the education and museum sectors in order to help build a more resilient society and strengthen social cohesion through changes in public discourse.
So Worlding Public Cultures, as Paul just said, uses worlding as its central methodology. Worlding is a concept that we're taking from Heidegger, but also from Spivak and Pansee, as well as many other authors who are thinking through the ways in which we imagine worlds. So the reason why we're using the word worlding, a verb, a gerund, rather than a noun, is that we imagine the world not as a spatial category, not as just a thing that's already pre-existing out there, but as a temporal category, meaning that we think of worlding as the process of making worlds, a process that is continuously open and continuously reworlded so that we can build more hopeful futures together as a kind of relational exercise. This concept helps us to think through the ways in which we are reimagining pedagogies, institutions, and data. These are the three strands of research that we are pursuing in Worlding Public Cultures, thinking through different ways of speaking about and teaching worlded art histories so that we can build larger narratives for students today. Thinking about institutions such as museums and universities as modes and platforms for public culture. So what we're doing is we're thinking about different ways that we can connect the university with the museum, and we're enacting that in our various projects and outputs. And the last part of our project is about data. It's about the fundamentals of how do we present what we know, how do we organize what we know, and how do those ordering structures change the ways in which reality is perceived. And so in decolonizing the structures of, for example, databases, what we're hoping to do is we're trying to change the ways in which we think about the global, the way we think about identities, and the ways in which we think about our intertwined histories. We've been working with all of the different city teams involved in Worlding Public Cultures to put together public events. These larger public events, which we've been calling academies in some cases, gatherings in other cases, or assemblies or colloque, are moments when our teams have been meeting together in order to explore particular aspects of our WPC project.
WPC is also, as already been stated, also has a major project on data where we are collecting information about exhibitions, conferences, syllabi from various sources, international sources, and documenting them in a database, a curated database. What we're trying to do with the database is to make visible the underlying data structure that organizes the database, and some of the ways in which the information is organized, some of the classes and categories that are used to segment information. So what we're doing is to a process of looking at some of these classes and properties, and then critiquing them. And we'll make those critiques available in pop-ups on the website of the data project.
WPC is also involved in publishing the work of WPC scholars and associated members. We have an open access book series called Worlding Public Cultures at ICI Berlin Press that has 4 registers: a lexicon of key terms and concepts, a record of all of the academies, case and companions. We wanted to make sure in this project to have each team convene a gathering so that we would be able to world from these multiple different perspectives. And one of the things that was really valuable about doing all of these various gatherings in different places, even though some of them were hybrid, was that we were able to learn a little bit more about place. What does it mean to world from Dresden, looking at the former GDR? And the transnational connections that were running through the communist world. And what does it mean to world through London? What does it mean to world through Amsterdam? And looking at the various sort of colonial trajectories that linked them to other places. Equally, in the context of Ottawa, I think it was very valuable for many of our European colleagues to understand a little bit more about settler colonialism. And so for us, the academies really served that function of being cited in different places. And so really enacted the worlding process.
When we started it with this academy in Ottawa, we talked about how to co-constitute the global world, the world together from multiple perspectives. But what I really learned, or what became much more important for me, was really asking, what are the social relations and hierarchies that have to consider when we do this? And that really, I think, relates very interestingly to the formats we chose to do all these gatherings, right? A gathering does something else than an academy. So thinking about these formats of coming together, organizing social relations in a certain way is really something I would like to think about more.
One of the evenings of the assembly, they had a real dance session and everybody was on the floor just dancing and moving and whatever. And so in a certain sense, I'm while the levels of academic work in this project has been without question rigorous, and in some ways sometimes even too rigorous, I would say, for some people, because reading Sylvia Wynter is never easy, not on any day. There has also been in an immensely difficult time personally for me, but over the last years when the project started officially when I went to UPenn, which was in January, and by April it was COVID, and then it was lockdown. And so in an immensely difficult time, the project was an attempt to ask about what forms of kinship can we create as we try to imagine more just, equitable, caring presents and futures. And in that sense, that was the underpinning of the assembly. In that sense, it was both methodological, critical, but it was also simply just an attempt to be human and to understand what that vulnerability is. It was attempt at a certain kind of love and joy in a very difficult space. So in that sense, the assembly for me was a critical question about what is the methodology, or what kind of methodology of commons look like, or of joy look like, or of an intellectual labor that is committed to the quality of intellectual work that we've all come to know and love and enjoy and believe in, but one that can also acknowledge the positionality, the vulnerability, the reality of creating work and what that might mean.
So the conference was called Worlding the Global, the Arts in the Age of Decolonization. And from my perspective, it was, I think, the second or the third conference in a series of conferences that I had collaborated with Birgit on organizing, to start talking about what it might mean to create a transnational network of research centers and scholars who are thinking about transnational and transcultural art history. And this is something that we've been thinking about for quite a while, because we realized that, strangely, even though we were all working on transnational and transcultural art histories, our networks and the conversations we were having were quite regional. And so we were trying to put all of these regions together in conversation. So we started thinking about doing this, and in conversation with our dear colleagues, Ruth Phillips and Conrad Robertson, we began thinking about what would it mean to be thinking about worlding from Ottawa, and what does it mean to be thinking about worlding from these unceded territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. And so the key term that came out of those conversations was that we needed to be thinking about decolonization in this context on these lands.
From my point of view, it has been so welcome to be able to be in dialogue with colleagues who work on what in my era we used to call great civilizations. In other words, we're all trying to free ourselves from an evolutionary model of cultural and historical development that we recognize to be colonial, imperial, and Western centric. But in the fields that I've worked in, which involve the arts of indigenous people, which were long categorized as primitive art, there was this other hierarchy in that they were marginalized and regarded as earlier or prior or outside modernity. Whereas I think people who worked in the fields that I've worked in, Africa and North America and other related areas, to us, the arts of India, China, Japan, the arts that our colleagues in this project, many of them work on, they somehow were accorded a higher level of respect. And what I've learned in a very, very simple way is that this whole challenge of worlding is a challenge that affects everyone to pretty much the same degree, but in different ways. And to start, as you were saying, with the Ottawa Academy, in which we recognize the importance of acknowledging our situated, located, placed perspective, and to acknowledge it as one that has to be informed by Indigenous histories in this place and Indigenous historical experiences. We really started from a point of departure that was unusual for me. I'm much more accustomed to being in a context where we start from the great civilization somehow, and these Indigenous histories are more on the edges. So it was very welcome, in other words, that we did start. I'm not sure if that was intentional or somewhat accidental that we began in Ottawa because the key organizers of the whole project had been located there. But as the opportunity to open the Academy in Ottawa and then to incorporate the opening of this grand, wonderful exhibition at the National Gallery, Abadakone, which was a global Indigenous contemporary art exhibition was really refreshing.
One of the main areas that Victoria and I worked on, and we took the lead on, is actually the early career scholar workshop. And we created a separate conference call for the panel and selected the papers. And then we actually paired an early career scholar with a different, a more senior scholar who was presenting or participating in the conference to provide as a discussant to their presentation on their research. And this was an interesting practice because it allowed us to create a space for scholars who were in our position at the time, and also to help build our own smaller networks for peers in an early stages of their academic career, and try to think about what worlding means for our generation of scholars, and how we might move into these academic spaces or alternative academic spaces, and sort of embody those ideas of worlding and the possibility that it can invite. And I think for me, this was an important point as I was trying to work out my own research areas and refine what type of scholar I wanted to be, what type of curator I wanted to be. And I think worlding then opened up that opportunity for me, because I wasn't really thinking about worlding before that point.
I think one of the insights that I gained from this long project and all of our discussions was the importance of actually thinking worlding as both a philosophical and a political project. That, in thinking about worlding, we can't forget about the importance of, reworlding. We can't forget about the importance of addressing certain types of violence, but then also thinking about what we can do in order to get beyond the binaries that those violences then create. And I think that that's precisely what we're trying to do with these worldings, right? We're trying to imagine what it might be like to have worlds created by multiple different subject positions, people, worldviews, and how do we make those worldviews, how do we make those worldings come together? How do we make them speak to each other? And perhaps treaties are one way for those agonistic worldings to come together. And, we've been talking a lot in this project about what does it mean once we have these multiple worldings, and how do we make a world of many worlds in terms of thinking through a pluriversal understanding of worlds that encompasses all of these different temporalities, histories, epistemologies, ontologies. And maybe we need to be thinking about treaties too.
A lot of the work on worlding in the Worlding Public Cultures project, I've done in collaboration with Victoria. And so I think that a lot of that, my thinking has evolved through our relationship. And we have co-written a chapbook summary of the Worlding the Global Conference that'll come out in the Ottawa chapbook. But we also have co-written a blog entry of our reflections of the Ottawa Academy. And one of the through lines through both of those, the summary and the reflection, is the idea of worlding as a way to enact relationalities, as a way to deepen in some way our relationships to each other, to communities, to our kind of field of research, to our identities, and the way that these reflections and these conversations and these collaborations are actually built through trust, and they're built through friendship. And that's similar to what Georgiana and Wanda were speaking about in their presentation at the Academy, is the idea that the work that they do and the collaboration they do was first and foremost built through friendship. And I think that that's something that we kind of, in our collaborations with each other, thinking about worlding, it's really come down to the conversations we have as friends that move into thinking about discursive ideas of worlding.
I think that has been something that has been so valuable about this project. First of all, that it grew out of existing friendships, but that it created a community of friendships. And here I'm thinking of a term that Leela Gandhi uses, affective communities, these sort of communities of affect that are ultimately political ones, that are motivated by a shared belief in working to make the world better. But at the same time, that because of that trust and that friendship, it allows for a certain amount of questioning, a certain level of debate, where people don't always agree with one another. And so that sharpens the ways in which we're thinking through different concepts. I think that has been really, for me, one of the most exciting aspects of Worlding Public Cultures, which was that we had this community of people who were, working in concert with the kinds of issues that were so important to us, but that really didn't always agree. And that's really important.
Well, probably the umbrella keywords are from Academy to Assembly. And the other keywords are, first of all, working together, working collaboratively and thinking about together, really together, an event. And the other ones is we thought of embracing the potentiality of the digital instead of complaining, oh no, this is not we are so sorry that it's not going to be the beautiful, warm and in the flesh events that we had planned, but try to really make the best out of the possibilities. And perhaps the last thing that I wanted to add, and this idea, I remember we talked about this idea of the possibility of multiple localities being included at the same time and on the same platform. That really enticed us, and to connect different places on the globe through that platform.
I think in terms of organizing it, one of the methodologies Nering and I didn't consciously adopt, but just emerged from how we were going about it, was to, in a sense, identify various people that we were interested in working with or that we were interested in inviting. But then the first point of call, in a sense, was having a conversation with them. So we spent quite a lot of time in preparation before any organization and any of that started happening. I think a lot of it was just more conversational, and to see what is it that people would want to do, what is it that they could envision themselves doing, how is it that they would want to inhabit the space, what is it that would allow them to feel happy about their participation, rather than something that they performed as part of a job, or for the various reasons what takes part in these things. And for me, at least, a lot of the shape of the organization really took flight from the conversations rather than the other way around. And I think in that way, to look at, for example, one of our facilitators didn't want the session recorded. So there was also a moment in which we went offline and it became private again, which at that moment in time, October 2021, I believe, was also quite powerful. A group of people being together without feeling that one is recorded. So, and that didn't, I think, come from me, or if I remember correctly, Nooning, but from the person itself in our conversation with her. It's always been, I think, something of a defining quality of the Dutch team that we none of us are Dutch. So there's a meeting in the Netherlands. We'll be meeting in the Netherlands, but we bring many other contexts with us as well. And so the first question I think that we were looking at is, how do we feel about the term academy? And because of our locatedness in other places, we felt that maybe that's a term we wanted to set aside in favor of other ways of imagining of being together. And so some of the suggestions we came up with included things like reasoning that from Wayne's position was a very important one for us to think through. Also the ways in which assembly is different in various contexts. That for Nuning and Tiara, it had valences that were maybe different for us. So that was the thing that we came up with, in a sense, was to think through this constituting togetherness and relationships, and from there, I think that everything was, how do we, who are the people that will we be inviting to speak? We need to speak in some way about this, and they would need to also be people who would be able to bring their own locatedness into a situation that was related to the other people there. So I think the ethos from the start was one of thinking across so many different locations and constituting relationships between them.
There were also very many interesting ramifications from Chiara, the idea of an assembly as a site for activist politics, especially among students in Italy, where she grew up, and what that might mean, a kind of counter-revolutionary space. For me and Karina, it had a double meaning, because we come from, I think, and more me, from a British colonized space. So it reminded me of having to go to assembly every morning at high school and what the regimental nature of that, to assemble, the assembly line, that kind of thing. So it also had its complexities in it. But in the end, it was an attempt to constitute what Nuning would call the commons, a space of common working together, thinking together, forming together, and to assemble together as a certain kind of activist politics, as one tried to create or fashion something anew together.
I think the main takeaway, and something that I would cherish the most for a long time from the Amsterdam Assembly, is that it actually managed to decenter sort of the roles of academics or intellectuals to be the main center for knowledge production, and that we somehow managed to bring many voices from various thinkers and creative practitioners and community organizers who were inhabiting non-university environment. And so that is one. And secondly, the structure of the event itself, because that the way we structure the Amsterdam Assembly is somehow the thing that actually managed to bring so many voices from outside. So it's no longer like a kind of presentation, but more like we embrace the kind of other forms of presentation, basically like storytelling, and then we bring in jamming. That's also an important concept that emerged from the Amsterdam Assembly, like reasoning being the ground, and then it somehow emerged other concepts as well, like jamming, and then in the middle, Karin and I also thought about a podcast, like thinking more about how can we bring in many organizers in the local context, that is Amsterdam and the Netherlands in general, but also how we can actually connect different localities. So for example, in the Connecting Ocean podcast, we invited people from Indonesia and South Africa from different contexts.
I have to say that I've always had a rather conflicted relationship with this notion of worlding. I am probably it's connected to my irritation with Heidegger, and well, of course, Heidegger has a very specific place in the history of European continental philosophy, but also with continental philosophy in general. I'm not a philosopher, and I have sort of the way of thinking of traditional continental European philosophy is not my own at all. So I have to say I am both uncomfortable with worlding precisely because of this lineage. And I'm not so convinced either by the recent attempt to save the term and to recuperate, so to speak, the good Heidegger. And like Feng Xia, I'm just not fully convinced. At the same time, I'm profoundly convinced that sort of the global is not only a problematic, but is in a way it has become almost a meaningless, an empty signifier, because it means everything. Everything is global. It is, everything is global today. So global is kind of meaningless. So in short, I'm not fully comfortable with that terms because of its lineage. At the same time, I have, it's one of those imperfect words and imperfect words that we live by, so to speak, and that we are trying to make our own. And certainly the assembly was a way for us to make, sort of to do worlding the way we like and the way we feel comfortable with and we feel happy about.
But I want to suggest that a critique of Heidegger does not foreclose the possibility of the term being analytically useful. And it probably is because of the capaciousness of the term, but also because I've enjoyed trying to understand what Gayatri Spivak thinks around it. And I've also enjoyed reading Esther Perens and her idea of worlding popular culture. And what was his name? Feng Che is my absolute favorite in our readings so far. Or the transhistorical, transcultural, some of the work that the people in the team have been doing. So in a certain sense, I'm there with worlding now because I think it opens up a set of conceptual and practical questions that are fruitful.
As far as I remember, none of the presentation or conversation during the Amsterdam Assembly mentioned the worlding, as a concept, but everything which was being discussed in that 3 days event engaged deeply in what making connection and making conversation happen, because there in different ways, everyone that we invited in the event, they express and convey messages about how their work actually about crafting their own worlds, their own communities, and then finding it's all about finding their own positionalities. So I guess that's our own take on what worlding really means. And we provide the space to make that kind of conversation actually happen.
You know, when the Amsterdam Assembly was staged, it was the first time I met a lot of people from WPC as a project, our international partners. And, you know, it was such a precarious time. And I just remember how that felt, partly because of what the Assembly gave us. But I also feel that subsequent academies and gatherings and so on were much more difficult for us to attend, including the one now, because of this thing that I said at the beginning, where we all come from different places. My and Nuning's passports, for example, don't allow us travel. And in retrospect, I'm very grateful that the Amsterdam Assembly, in a sense, was the first one that was organized in our time as part of the project, and was this moment of togetherness. And I'm very mindful of how that togetherness has been frustrated by bureaucratic, nationalistic, exclusionary regulations from the countries of which we are not part.
I've been approached or had this conversation with some artists and community organizers whom we invited in the Amsterdam Assembly, that they actually asked about the continuation of the Amsterdam Assembly, and how they are actually hoping to hear more about, for example, the Connecting Oceans podcast that I mentioned previously, and that actually became sort of like a model of thinking about connecting different collectives from different contexts. So I think this is actually an important point, and there is a hope in there that even though we started Amsterdam Assembly, partly like obligation, that this is something that has to be done, but many people hoping that this is something that to continue. So I think this sort of like proves an important point of having this kind of model of gathering rather than a more conventional academic kind of gathering.
The London gathering, Consent Not to Be a Single Being, was it kind of originated out of a number of discussions between myself and Ming and Toshio and others around responding to the Life Between Islands exhibition, which was the first major exhibition around Caribbean art and Caribbean descended artists at TATE Britain. We were thinking about ways of worlding that discussion, on thinking about the ways in which the Caribbean is more than just a particular location. There's also been an incredible stream of thought and thinking that have come out of Caribbean writers, thinkers, artists, etc. And we kind of coalesced around the works of Edouard Glissant, Sylvia Wynter, and Stuart Hall as being kind of leitmotifs for this kind of worlding through the Caribbean, through Caribbean thinking and thought, which has been for a long time circulating in the realm of contemporary art, but never really explicitly acknowledged.
For me, the conference itself was an amazing way to kind of really broaden out some of the things that were, I think, fairly implicit in the exhibition itself. and to kind of also bring it into dialogue with a more kind of transnational conversation around contemporary art and contemporary Black thought. And so this is something that I think was really great about the conference itself, and also allowed us as the London team to develop a program alongside it that spoke to that. And I think, so I curated the film and audio program that sat alongside the conference and was live during the 3 days of the conference. The Soundworks are still online because they were specially commissioned for the project. And I think these were, for me, really interesting ways to kind of think about the theoretical like proposals of Hall, Glisson and Winter through different forms. And I think that was really an important thing to think about, because they are all theoreticians who are invested in a multitude of cultural forms, and poetics is such an important thread running through all of their work. And so the Sound Commissions kind of look to draw out some of those kind of intricacies. And so the two people that I invited were Ashley Holmes, who is an artist and DJ, and is really interested in the legacy of Caribbean sound as it connects to Britain and the diaspora, and sound as a place of exploring kind of liminality through this sort of through Caribbean and Black geographies more broadly. And so his piece really looked at the musical traditions of dub music, and it's an experimental composition that really weaves together all of a lot of sort of soundscapes and samples and recordings and field recordings that kind of take us on this journey of a sort of a journey that's kind of influenced by Glissant's poetics of relation. And then the other person was Aisha Hamid, whose project Radio Brown Atlantis was something that's really interesting in terms of what's already been spoken about, that sort of Afro-Asian dialogue and the kind of colonial history that creates these interconnections between these communities. And specifically the Radio Brown Atlantis program speaks to different practitioners, thinking about how brown and Black bodies have been sort of displaced and thrown into relation within these kind of connections of oceanic colonial roots. And she was in conversation with the poet Shivani Ramlochan, Trinidadian poet, who spoke about the kind of violence of indenture, of sexual violence within that history too, and then the kind of potential of poetry to bear kind of witness to certain colonial histories. So I think those were really important ways to sort of come into dialogue with the wider conference and the film program as well.
So the London program, in addition to the international conference with TATE, which was online, and also Rahila's amazing curatorial program, which also was online, we also worked with the MA Fine Art program at Chelsea to work with students in studios at Chelsea with artists. So Rahila organised a workshop with an artist, and also we did. The students responded to the theme of the conference: consent not to be a single being, and also Caribbean thinking. And we discussed. We did some online seminars with the students and discussions around extracts of Glissant's writing, and which produced actually a number of artworks and a small exhibition of that work. The other thing I would highlight as well, which I think speaks to the idea of calling it a gathering, is that we wanted to think about the wider context of London and and looking at the Caribbean diaspora and the Caribbean history and the more radical aspects of Caribbean intellectual history and cultural history. So we did a visit to the Black Cultural Archives in Brixton with a number of our colleagues. And also we did a visit on site at Chelsea to INIVA, which is the Institute for International Visual Arts, which has a long history and is associated with Stuart Hall, actually. Stuart Hall was the chair of that organization, which has an amazing library and resource. And we did like a tour of that as well. So the idea of gathering, I think, so there was a discussion, I think, among the team that we weren't comfortable with the idea of academy, given the academy's kind of Eurocentric roots, and gathering felt more, if you like, horizontal, more kind of democratic and more plural.
So the idea of the Dresden Academy had been born in a way even before I joined the Heidelberg team. So Monica Juneja had a long-standing relationship with the director of the Dresden State Art Collections. Her name is Marion Ackermann. She's a very influential lady here in Germany, and they had previously collaborated on a kind of trans-city collaboration that was with other parts of Germany. So Monica and Marion had collaborated on a previous exhibition, I think in 2019 or 2020, that was termed the Global Museum in Germany. And that was a kind of a countrywide initiative for different museums to diversify their profiles and become more global and transnational. So it was really off the back of that Monica had the idea that we could collaborate with the Dresden State Art Collections. So in 2021, what our team did was we did several trips actually to Dresden and to Leipzig, where the Dresden State Art Collections are spread. And we got to meet with the different curators, we got to see the different collections, and we really got to speak with them about the kind of challenges that they were facing as a museum, or actually rather as a collection of 17 museums overall, at a time when the socio-political climate in the state of Saxony was just becoming increasingly conservative and right-wing. So how could they, through their collections and through the work of their curators, also start to reflect a kind of global consciousness, a decolonial consciousness? So with that in mind, we wanted to develop an academy which talked not only about the collections themselves, but also what we as researchers then could do to both assist their cause, but also to deepen the kind of research exchange that existed between museums and universities. So we decided to do the Academy together with the bigger Worlding Public Cultures Network in a way that it would have several sections. The one section would be quite experiential in a way, that we could invite the visitors and the participants to actually see these different sections of the Dresden State Art Collections. So we organized tours in the collections, meetings with the curators and the archivists, and really giving people a platform to discover what are the site-specific challenges of these museums in Germany. Then the Academy itself, we structured part of it in quite a conventional way. We had regular panels and speakers that spoke about different exhibition histories, different types of collaborations between universities and museums, but also not just large museums, but also smaller curatorial initiatives, traveling exhibitions. There was also an emerging scholars panel, which I think was for me very important also to see what the younger generation is doing in the way of organizing, thinking about the role of artistic practice as well in the museum. And then in the evening, we had something that was much more discursive, and those were the so-called impulse discussions. And they really centered on three themes that we thought were quite pertinent in a way to have as a cross conversation between the curators working in Dresden on the one hand and the scholars whom we were inviting to come for the Academy on the other hand. So the three main topics for that, one was what is actually research in the museum and what are alternative forms of research in the museum? How can a museum interact with society and what is its public? And then the last one was what new epistemologies and ways of knowing can we actually take out of the museum? So this was overall the Academy. On the one hand, I thought it was extremely productive to give external people a glimpse into the very site-specific challenges and tasks that these curators had to work with. On the other hand, part of our mission had also been to initiate a certain kind of change within the museums. And this was the challenging part then for us, because it's a massive institution. It's a very bureaucratic institution, and change takes a long time. So I had the feeling that some curators we reached very well, but on the other hand, it's such a big institution that to say that we had a very kind of widespread impact, it's far too early for that.
So the Heidelberg Academy Lessons Learned was actually not taking place in Heidelberg, and for a reason, because Heidelberg is a small university, comparatively small university town, and lacks a lot of big museums. So since the get-go of our Worlding Public Cultures project, we thought about really cooperating with the Staatliche Kunstsammlung Dresden, which is a very rich, multifaceted collection conglomerate, you could say, and really far, like locally far distanced from Heidelberg, but very close to our transcultural querying. How to put art on display, what is actually called art and why, and how to deal in new ways, in worlded ways, with the many objects that long-standing collections like the Dresden ones actually have in their archives and sometimes also on show. So we were very happy to have them agreeing to our collaboration, and also making it a kind of a twofold event, not only with Dresden, but also with another cultural institution, the ICI, the Institute for Cultural Inquiry, that is based in Berlin. And so we had, since the get-go, for conceptualizing our academy, a very interesting institutional cooperation at hand, and also a very complex double task of us wanting to build a bridge from the high-fly academic discourses of a very transcultural approach to art history, and the actual curatorial practices and the daily work that a lot of curators in Dresden do, as opposed to, again, a very theoretically and public-facing discursive labor that the ICI stands for in Berlin. And we ended up, in the end, organizing two events. One was what we call the Lessons Learned Academy in Dresden, which was then really informed about not only staging papers and giving keynote lectures and discussing in a very scholarly way, but really relating this practice with walking through a lot of collections and talking in conversation and exploring in conversation what worlding these collections might mean with the local curators. And that was the first part. And the second part was then the workshop that took place afterwards in Berlin, where we attempted to narrow this focus a little bit and ask for lessons learned regarding our higher learning in university-based art history, and the question of syllabi. So this was a very narrow focus, but also an equally important one, because we as scholars really are faced with the daily question of how to actually world what we see in our textbooks, and how to bring across a kind of a new perspective to students coming from all different parts of the world, increasingly also to Heidelberg, and making sense of that relationality and the complexity of what artistic and visual practices mean in a globalized world.
For the planning phase of the Academy, which it became apparent from the beginning that we wanted to have an emerging research panel, because I think WPC in general tries to also enable voices of emerging scholars, curators, artists, and try to keep low hierarchies as much as possible. So also for our academy, we planned on doing that, and that was also something which Moritz, Mickey, and I organized. And it was important, to have a panel, emerging research panel as part of Academy, which was not only open to junior scholars, but also keep it open to emerging curators and artists. And the participants actually gave us very valuable insights into the practices from within the museum, but also beyond the museum and between institutions in the arts also. And it was, the panel then also became really quite valuable or enriching because we had so many insights from case studies, but also from the practice of the petitioners themselves. And we also then have now the opportunity to include those panel participants within the Academy volume as well. So, yeah.
I was, for the record, one of those. Maybe I'll include this part. I was one of those practitioners trying to bridge the theoretical and the practical.
Yeah. And I think the panel also really opened up wonderfully the Academy and also this question about learning across institutions in the arts, and where actually people working at these thresholds, what they do and what they experience. And then we could wonderfully keep on going from that with those questions in mind, from insights from people working within those fields.
A really important component of the Academy that was special for me. And of course, it was the Emerging Scholars panel, which I was more involved with than the other parts of the Academy. And I think the word emerging scholar, or the phrase emerging scholar, was pretty critical in trying to attract people who might not be familiar with our project. And we were quite deliberate in not defining what we mean by emerging scholar. By that, I mean, we didn't say that whoever is applying to be an emerging scholar presenter didn't have to be an advanced master's student or a current PhD student. And we did, in fact, get applications and submissions from emerging scholars who previously had no contact with us. And we had the honor of actually hearing their presentations, which were wonderful and reminded us that there's work being done even outside of the WPC team.
While the other teams choose to have gatherings or assembly, we deliberately chose to stick with Academy because we thought of it like a place where we all come together, and we wanted to emphasize that in this place we learn from each other. So this is why we stuck to Academy. This is this was a really important thing to us, and I think in the end it really was that way, that we learned from each other, and especially having like different kinds of panels during the Academy. It wasn't like the hierarchical notion that's maybe plays a part in the term Academy didn't really play that big part in Dresden. It was more like really everyone was learning from each other. Like the senior scholars learned from the emerging scholars, and the museum staff learned from the university staff, and vice versa. And this was, I think it really worked out in the end.